Chapter 17. Peace came officially at 1 minute past midnight on May 7th, 1945. On our knees we thanked God for the protection which He had given to us, and that at last the agony was over. Some of the people who had been living with us in Gutenberg went back to their homes, and we tried to return to a semblance of normal life. The Gutenbergs seemed to have a good reputation among the American staff. I wondered if it could be possible that they knew of the high price which we had paid for our freedom and the relentless fight made by our family against Nazism. I had to act as interpreter in many instances between the military government and the population. I was also asked to give information regarding the reliability of people in the area surrounding Gutenberg. The non-fraternization regulation precluded any close contact with our military guests. But one evening, Captain Henry Cassademont asked to see me. He told me that he wished to ask a favour, and he seemed to be rather embarrassed. I was curious as to just what the favour could be. When he told me, I had a great difficulty in keeping a serious face. He had, he said, 2 small baby wild boars named Max and Tony. He wished my permission to keep them in his bedroom. Fortunately, we were all very fond of animals, and I was glad to grant his request, although he could have kept the pets without having to ask me. The little animals were quite unaware of any non-fraternization regulations, and the incident of the wild boars was the beginning of a real friendship between our family and the young American captain. One evening my grumbling Gretchen came into my room. She was always glad for an excuse to have a little chat. I could tell from her manner that she had something on her mind. "What is it you wish to tell me?" I asked, to give her a chance to unburden herself. "I wish that the Baroness could see the room of this young American captain. It is unbelievable what junk he has brought with him. There must be a truckload of it. His room looks just like the rooms of the young barons." Then her churlishness vanished. "I must say that in spite of his junk and his wild pigs, he seems to be a very nice young man. The kind of a person that the Baroness will like." She looked at me from the corner of her eye. "You may like him even more when I tell you that I found a Bible in his room." The young captain had made a conquest of Gretchen. He did not know it, but that was a real triumph. Weeks had passed since the American occupation, and still there was no news from the Stauenbergs. Now that I could get some gasoline from our conquerors, I went to see the military governor in the next town and told him the entire story of July 20th and the people who had been taken in Sippenhaft. "You have a car?" he asked. I told him that I had. "Then I shall give you a pass and gasoline. Go to Buchenwald and see if you can find any trace of your relatives. Let us hope that you will find them." I shall never forget that drive through the devastated land. Even the smallest bridges had been destroyed. The larger towns lay in ruins, but everywhere the American guards were courteous and helpful. Buchenwald was like a bled-out wound. Ghosts still walked its streets, ghosts of those who had died there, and living ghosts. Former prisoners now set free, but still in their striped prison suits, moved feebly between the barracks, a lost look in their sunken eyes. I went immediately to the American commanding officer of the camp. "Do you know whether the Stauenberg family is here?" "I know they are not here. All I can tell you is that they have been here and were moved out by the Gestapo with other prominent prisoners. No one knows what has become of them. By the way, the widow of Count Klaus Stauenberg just left me an hour ago. She was looking for her 4 lost children. She does not know if they are dead or alive." That was the first news I had had that Nina survived. As I was leaving the officers' barracks, a former prisoner of the camp approached me. He was old-looking, a living skeleton with sunken eyes and cheeks and white hair. "I saw your license plate. You are from Bavaria. Would you be so kind as to take a card with you and try to mail it in Bavaria? I want my family to know that I am alive, and I don't want them to know that I'm here." "I'll be glad to post your card." "How long have you been here?" I asked, trying not to stare at him. He shook his head. "I can't speak about it yet, but hell would be heaven after the tortures of Buchenwald." He began to tremble so violently over the memories of horror that I turned away. "The Americans are kind," he went on. "They give us nourishing food, but our organs aren't used to real food. I shall have to stay here until I'm stronger, strong enough to go home to Bavaria." I had a feeling that in spite of his appearance he was a young man. There was a forthright look in his sunken eyes. I hoped that he would recover. As I drove away from Buchenwald, I wondered what special punishment God would have for the fiends who had ruled that city of horror. Since my search was fruitless, there was nothing to do but to return to Gutenberg. I dreaded to face Clemens. I had wanted to be able to take him some news which would give him peace of mind. Clemens, as I had feared, was on the steps in the courtyard waiting for me. I shook my head. "Dear Clemens, all I know is that they were taken away from Buchenwald. We shall go on searching and hoping." Word reached me late in June that there had been damage in Weisendorf, but there were no details as to what had happened. I was too weary to care. When life became less complicated, I would go to Weisendorf and see the extent of the damage and how it could be repaired. My only thought now was to have my son back at home and to find the Stauenbergs. A few days after my trip to Buchenwald, we were all assembled in the dining room when Marquard Stauenberg, who had been with the Sippenhaft prisoners for the past year, rushed into the room. What joy, what happiness for father and son! "Marquard, where have you come from?" everyone asked in one voice. "From Dachau." Clemens was weeping with joy. "Where are mother and the others?" "I don't know, Papa. All of the so-called important prisoners were taken from Dachau camp at the approach of the American army. They were all packed into trucks. Our family, Pastor Niemöller, Leon Blum and his wife, Chancellor Schuschnigg, Monsignor Neuhauser, General Holder, about 140 people in all. Thank God there was no room in the trucks, so 2 other young men and myself offered to make the journey on foot with SS guards. The guards did not know the countryside, so I offered to lead the way. Marquard laughed at the recollection. I led them around and around Munich like a slow-moving merry-go-round, so that the days would pass. On May Day, the Americans marched into Munich, and that morning our SS guards disappeared. I can't give you news of the others. All I know is that they were taken south. But have you heard about Lita?" "Lita?" I asked. "No." "She is dead." "Dear, wonderful Lita. How did it happen? The last time I saw her was at Hof Airfield when she brought your father." She flew straight back to Buchenwald, and circling low over the barracks in which the family had been imprisoned, she saw that they were empty. She landed and found that her husband Alex and the others had been transferred to East Bavaria. She tried to follow them in her plane, but it was shot down. No one knows by whom. "Poor Alex," Clemens exclaimed. "Klaus, young Berthold, and now his wife. Another precious life gone." Marquard had come in a car, and he had brought a doctor for his father. In the morning they left for Jettingen. We had another happy surprise on the following day when the car belonging to the Landrat of Hof drew up in the courtyard. In the car was a young woman dressed in black carrying a small baby in her arms. It was Nina Stauenberg and the infant daughter who had been born in prison. Nina still possessed much of her exotic charm, but after the shocking death of her wonderful husband and her long, cruel imprisonment, it was not surprising that she looked worn and far older than her years. We were all astonished that the Gestapo had not exterminated the wife of Klaus Stauenberg. Perhaps they had expected her to die in childbirth. When she had survived that terrible ordeal, she and the infant had been sent south to join the other members of the family. While she was being transferred from one prison camp to another, Nina had succeeded in eluding her SS guards. She had hidden away with the baby in a small hut near the city of Hof. Now we welcomed her with all our hearts. "Oh, Elizabeth," she exclaimed, "if only I could learn something about my children. I had hoped to find them in Buchenwald, where the kind Landrat took me, but they knew nothing about them there. All I've been able to learn is that the Gestapo hid them in central Germany." The reason it was so difficult to trace the Stauenberg children was that the Gestapo had changed their names. It had been the intention of the Nazis to educate these children, who had a background of hundreds of years of culture and good breeding, and make Nazi leaders of them. It was a heinous way to misuse the children of their great enemy. Much later we heard a story about one of the little boys. The children of Klaus Stauenberg had been given the name of Meister, but, young as they were, they refused to answer to the name. One of them was taken by a nurse to a dentist in a small town. "This is one of our little Meisters," she said, knowingly to the doctor. The child jumped up and shouted, "I am not a little Meister. I am Heimerand Stauenberg, the son of a brave and wonderful papa." Many months passed before Nina miraculously found her children, still hidden in central Germany. By that time, Nina had resigned herself to the belief that she would never see them again. As weeks dragged on, I knew that in Jettingen, Clemens was worrying himself to death. Why had I not thought of going to Cardinal Faulhaber in Munich for help? I again explained my mission to the American military governor and again secured a pass and gasoline to set out for the capital. In Munich, when I telephoned to the Cardinal's palace, his assistant answered the call. "What can I do for you, Baroness?" "I wish to ask the help of His Eminence in getting some information about my relatives, the Stauenbergs." "You have come on the right day. An hour ago we received a telephone call telling us that the Stauenberg family arrived in Munich this morning. Come at once and you will be here in time to welcome them." I rushed to the palace, but it was an hour before the door opened, and Elizabeth, my darling Elizabeth, and her children, Marie Gabrielle and Otto Philipp, with all the other surviving members of the family, entered the room. Oh, what unbelievable joy! The Cardinal shared our happiness as we wept and laughed. It was incredible that their long and agonizing ordeal and my search were over. The following day I drove Elizabeth and the children to Jettingen. At last the family was united, and again we laughed and wept. The joy and excitement was almost more than Clemens' heart could stand. I did not leave until I had heard their story. After they were taken from the Dachau camp, at the time Markard had been separated from them, they were put in a camp near Innsbruck. As the Americans advanced, they were again moved farther into the Alps, this time near the Brenner Pass. The SS who were guarding them had received instructions from General Headquarters that these prisoners should under no circumstances fall alive into Allied hands. Cases of explosives had accompanied them all along the journey as they were moved from place to place just ahead of the Allied advance. All of them knew the use to which the explosives were to be put. The original plan had been to hold these prisoners as hostages for Hitler's last stand in his Alpine retreat in Berchtesgaden. Among the prisoners there were prominent English people, French and Russians. One morning, Colonel von Bonin, himself one of the prisoners, succeeded in escaping from the camp. Because he was still in uniform, he was able, at a nearby army guardroom, to put through an emergency call to the next German army group. The commanding general, who was by chance one of his close friends, promised to send a Wehrmacht detachment at once, which would take over the protection of the prisoners. An SS guard, noticing the disappearance of Colonel Bonin, followed him and overheard a portion of this conversation. Realizing the gravity of the situation, the SS now did not dare to carry out their instructions to blow up the prisoners. When the Wehrmacht detachment arrived, the SS guards had vanished. On May 4th, 1945, American troops of the Fifth Army captured the political prisoners near the Brenner Pass and sent them for internment to the Isle of Capri. They remained there until it was decided what was to be done with them individually. There, under American protection, but still prisoners, the Stauenbergs had remained for several months, until the day when they were flown back to Munich in an American plane. After all my anguish and searching, I felt numb with joy. "Oh, Elizabeth dear, how wonderful it is to see you again. It is like having you come back to life from the dead." "Back to life," she replied, with a smile that I will never forget. "You know, dear, I don't feel that I shall ever really find my way back." On my way from Jettingen to Gutenberg, I found that Karl Theodor's young wife and baby daughter had returned from the Bavarian Alps, where they had been visiting. Non-fraternization was over, and Nivis and Teresa were thoroughly enjoying the social life which was now permissible with our military guests. The officers entertained our friends in the neighbourhood as well as their own, and there was much coming and going. Once again, the old rooms of Gutenberg were filled with happy people. Electric power for the castle was completely broken down, and repair parts were not available, but the resourceful Americans supplied us with candles. It was very glamorous, living in the house entirely lighted by candlelight. We entertained our guests from the New World with evenings of games, music, and singing. I was surprised to discover that my daughter Teresa had a very true and pleasing voice, a voice which I realized should be cultivated. Soon the enemy was very much at home in Gutenberg, and we could really appreciate our freedom after so many years of persecution. We were all very pleased when our young Captain Henry, as we called him, received the appointment of Director of Military Government for the Gutenberg district. The only sad part was that he had to move to the district headquarters. This young man handled his highly responsible task in a strict but just manner. He helped the poor and needy, but he was well aware of a dangerous Nazi element which still existed. Everyone had grown very fond of him, especially my dark-eyed Nivis. There was a great change in her. She was suddenly gay and happy, this child who had always been so serious and quiet. I remembered my worries about her lack of interest in her appearance. I no longer had any cause to worry on that score. During the long months of our serious troubles, there had not been any opportunity for me to go to Konnersreuth to see my friend Resel Newman. I had not seen her since just after the death of Philip Franz. One day I approached Henry Castamont and asked him if he would drive me to Konnersreuth. He gladly agreed. It was a wonderful day for me, riding through the beautiful autumn countryside, but there was an ache in my heart. The last time that I had driven to Konnersreuth, Philip Franz had taken me there, and it had been just such a cloudless day with a hint of fall in the air. Resel, with her gift of discernment, told me what I had already felt, that this young American boy was an exceptionally fine person. When we left Konnersreuth, it was settled that Henry was to return the following week and drive Resel and Father Neighbour to Gutenberg. That first visit of Resel to our home was a rare privilege, for she never left Konnersreuth except for an annual stay in the house of the late Professor Wutz in Eichstadt. It was a wonderful experience to have Resel in Gutenberg. With keen interest, she went through all of the rooms. She prayed with us in our chapel and even went down into the crypt under the chapel to the place where Enoch was buried. While we had our midday meal, Resel, who never takes food, rested on my own bed, and during the afternoon, while we sat and talked, she held my little granddaughter on her lap. When the time came for Henry to drive Rezel and Father Neighbour home, he took pictures of us in the courtyard. After that we gathered every single flower in the garden and filled the car with them, so that Rezel could have the pleasure of decorating the altars in Connersroith. I went back into the chapel and thanked God for the joy of that day. For me it seemed that the presence of Rezel of Connersroith had brought a very special blessing on our home. One afternoon, soon after this visit, we were all seated around the fire in the library, laughing and talking and listening to music over the radio. The only sad face was that of my daughter-in-law, Rose Sophie, who seemed to be outside the happy circle. I knew how she longed for Karl Theodor, and I tried to bring her into the conversation by speaking about him. I said that I wished that Karl Theodor were there to enter into this new happy life after so many years of anxiety and sorrow. The words had scarcely left my lips when the door opened and Karl Theodor rushed into the room. With a cry, his young wife was in his arms. Now our joy was complete. Karl Theodor looked well. His time as a British prisoner of war had certainly not been hard on him. Happiness and peace would come again to Gutenberg. Karl Theodor and Rose Sophie would now take their place as master and mistress. I wanted above all things to rest. I did not realize how tired I was. Just when I had made up my mind to go into retirement and do nothing for many months, I received a letter from the Catholic Women's Union of Bavaria asking me to come to Munich at once to discuss a new charity organization for the relief of the victims of the war. The plan was to unify all welfare groups for the stupendous task of rehabilitation in Bavaria. I told myself that I did not feel physically equal to such a task. Also, I could not forget that a great percentage of the people who suffered had brought the misery on themselves. I remembered what Enoch had said on his deathbed about the German guilt. I thought of all the people who had been glad to follow the piper and now paid the price for the tune. I thought of the inhabitants of Weimar who protested that they had not known what went on in Buchenwald. On the other side of the scale was the fact that Germany would be the focal point of a terrific war of ideas. The evil of a demoniac power was ready to move in from the east. Within Germany there was the great misery in human history. Cities mangled beyond recognition. 50% of all habitation had been destroyed. 12 million people were without homes. People were living in makeshift camps, cellars, and like animals in piles of rubble. There were thousands of unclaimed orphans, too young even to know their own names. There were also the aged, for whom there was no future, who prayed for death, the starving to be fed, the naked to be clothed. Unless these people were given some spiritual as well as physical aid, all Europe would sink into a morass of moral disintegration. There was a chance to strengthen the inner circle of Christianity in Bavaria, which had astonishingly survived in thousands of courageous souls. I knew in my heart that this would be the greatest battle against evil that Germany had ever faced. It would be a battle of love, a battle of the spirit. I thought of Enoch and his fight for the good. I went again to his study and stood before the statue of St. George, where we had stood together on that first morning in Gutenberg, his arm around me as he had said, "Fighting the evil, that is what we are meant to do, you and I." I remembered how vividly I had felt at the time of his death that he had bequeathed to me his battle against evil. What would Enoch have done now? I knew that he would have dedicated his life again, both our lives, to the rehabilitation of the country which he loved. This request for me to found an organization for rehabilitation I could not refuse. When I went to Munich, I trembled on discovering the vastness of the task. Again I told myself that I was too tired. I wanted time to think. I wanted to see for myself some of the things which had been told to me. From town to town, from city to city I went. To the charity centres came women in reeking rags. There was no soap, no needle, no thread. Grey flesh covered protruding bones. Everywhere eyes stared at me, eyes that had long ago forgotten the relief of tears. I saw mothers with newborn infants wrapped in filthy scraps of cloth or paper. Everywhere there were waifs, more animal than human, who did not know their names. There were the maimed, the homecomers, those pathetic prisoners of war from Russia, with no shoes on their swollen, sore-crusted feet, hunger dropsy swelling their miserable bodies. Homecomers, human wrecks who had been kept alive by the hope of once more returning to home and loved ones. Their homes no longer existed. Their families were dead or scattered. Everywhere I saw ground that was fertile for the poisoned seed of nihilism. From one end of the country to the other, there was no hope. The cry was that there was no God. What might lie ahead was so momentous that the thought made me ill. It would be a long and painful and many times a thankless task. I was feeling more and more the overwhelming physical and emotional strain of the past years. Every nerve in my body cried out for rest. I asked myself, would there ever again be rest? Not while such misery and despair fill the hearts and souls of my people. I was told that it would be impossible to find a place to live in Munich, but the impossible was accomplished. I went to see my good friend Cardinal Faulhaber, who promised to give me every support. He himself wrote personal letters to all of the bishops of Bavaria. Next, I went to see the Public Welfare Department of the military government, where I found strong and sympathetic help. The preliminary work of founding the Caritas Women's Relief Committee for the Victims of War was begun. For me, it meant stepping across the threshold into a completely different life.